Well, the operation's gone very well. As a result of what we started at 4 o'clock this morning, the position now in Northern Ireland is that anyone can go anywhere at any time. And that's what I wanted to achieve.
On the 31st of July 1972, the British Army launched its largest ground operation since the Suez Crisis of 1956. Over 22,000 British troops, supported by HMS Fearless, Centurion tanks and bulldozers, poured into Northern Ireland, determined to end the barricaded no-go areas in Belfast, Derry and beyond once and for all, and to crush the IRA in the process.
We knew that the army were going to come in that night. We knew they were going to break through all the barricades.
I suppose I was thinking and planning about what would happen next in terms of our fight against the IRA.
If I step out onto the street, I'll be arrested or worse, killed. What do I do?
I think what did come as a big surprise was the scale of it, which was absolutely enormous.
The purpose was, the aim was to clear the no-go areas, and it certainly did that.
In scenes reminiscent of a war zone and never seen before or since in the United Kingdom, the full might of the British Army's military hardware was deployed onto civilian streets as thousands of troops flooded into ordinary communities, determined to reinstate the force of British law. Using previously unseen archive footage, Insight takes you inside the story of Operation Motorman and the Army's first real attempt to muscle the IRA out of existence and bring an end to the conflict. But as Motorman ended and the dust settled in December 1972, it was clear that the conflict was not going to end. The barricades had been destroyed, but the IRA had moved on, prepared for the long war, which was to last for another 22 years. "1972 was the most violent year of the conflict. Just 3 years on from their origins in street protests and riots in 1969, the Troubles had become a bloody fight between the IRA, the British Army and loyalist paramilitaries. The year began ominously, with January seeing the deaths of 2 policemen in Derry being followed within days by the killings of 14 civilians on Bloody Sunday. As the shockwaves of Bloody Sunday reverberated, the killings continued relentlessly. The events in Derry were followed by the first Republican bombs in England at the Aldershot Barracks, a no-warning bomb at the Abercorn Bar, and the unfolding of a wider bombing campaign. By the end of the year, almost 500 people had been killed.
My memory of it was great political upheaval. Obviously, that was your Bloody Sunday, and term without trial was still in place. You had the fall of Stormont, the imposition of direct rule. You also had a full-blown guerrilla war going on in the streets between the IRA and the British Army.
My first tour was mainly riot control and protecting property. On the second tour, it was more gun battles and bombs, and the violence has increased terribly in those 2 years.
The intensification of the conflict also prompted political change, with Westminster taking back charge of Northern Ireland from Stormont under direct rule in March of 1972.
Now, if you go to the Public Record Office here in Belfast at the Titanic Quarter, you can see now the minutes of all those endless, cabinet meetings, discussing again and again, the no-go areas. Pressure being put onto the British government to do something about it, the British government's unwillingness to do anything about it. So that, in a sense, was the position that was inherited by the direct rulers who had come in, as you remember, in 1972.
Since entering Northern Ireland in 1969, the British Army, under political direction, had allowed the continued existence of barricaded no-go areas in Derry, Belfast and elsewhere. These no-go areas were largely, but not exclusively, in Republican districts, and effectively created spaces where Republicans could recruit, organise and freely move without fear of arrest or observation.
I mean, I suppose it's unimaginable now when you drive through the Bogside, you know, that the very streets that you drive through, Rossville Street and the Lecky Road and or the Cregan, were areas that back in 1972, 1971, 1972, that people just drove along in a hijacked car, in an appropriated car as they would call it, jumped out and threw up a checkpoint with guns and pistols and rifles, and you know, nobody said anything.
We were quick to realise that in fact these no-go areas where barriers had been erected were there to prevent us from patrolling, patrolling in particular in the areas in which we wanted to patrol.
Why could the Army not do something about these no-go areas as they became known? Why did they not move in? Why did they not take over? And that was a real sense of frustration in the Protestant areas, because they couldn't see why these people would be allowed to build up their own no-go areas. No-go meant the police didn't go in. If we were being policed, why weren't they being policed? And there was all that discussion going on, and that was feeding into the fear that was around. I mean, there were a lot of murders that year, a lot of very nasty things happened, and that was feeding into it, that the Protestant community actually thought they were under siege, and they would have to stand up. If the government wasn't going to do it, then they would have to do it for themselves.
The origins of the no-go areas lay in the street protests of 1969 and opposition to the RUC, but they'd been largely allowed to remain in place by Westminster in those early days of the conflict, as the government sought to avoid all-out confrontation and negotiate a path away from worsening violence. As it became clearer through 1969 and 1970 that conflict and confrontation were intensifying, the barricades became a real problem for the government. Whilst the introduction of internment in 1971 was aimed at tackling the IRA, the thorny issue of no-go was never fully addressed.
Belfast and the New Lodge was different, for example, than Derry. It was quite obvious that, you know, Derry was under the control of large sections of it, of the IRA, and the British weren't going into those areas. That hadn't been the case in the New Lodge. The British still would have patrolled the area, but it was limited access. Any time they would have come in, they were running the risk of being ambushed or shot at.
We knew that there were bad guys hiding in areas where we weren't allowed to go, in inverted commas, and they were stashing weapons, they were stashing material that could be used against us, and so it was natural that it was very frustrating.
Well, it was definitely a safe haven because we couldn't go into them to arrest the bombers and the gunmen. They would fire at us from inside there and we couldn't do nothing about it.
Looking back on it, it seemed almost a given that there was never going to be consent to make any sort of forcible entry into those areas. So, you know, we toyed with all sorts of strange nostrums. I mean, what could you do short of physical force? You know, could you cut off electricity supplies? All sorts of daft notions were being tossed about. And you know, not leading anywhere. But the premise was that since the British government, before they introduced direct rule, had been so reluctant to see the Northern Ireland government taking on the no-go areas, it seemed highly unlikely that a direct rule administration would want to do exactly that.
The no-go areas created conditions in which paramilitary groups could thrive, and as they took hold, it became clear that removing the barricades would provoke major clashes. Clashes which would firmly set the army in opposition to the nationalist populations of Belfast and Derry.
And clearly, from the word go, there was a great reluctance on the part of a British government to get any kind of combat situation between the armed forces and the populace. So, I mean, I can't tell you how often, Chichester Clark in the first place and Brian Faulkner thereafter were going along saying, look, can't something be done about this? But always the policy was, you know, softly, softly.
I suppose in many ways, you know, it put it back to communities to protect themselves and to do, you know, to join paramilitary organisations. So that's what we had. And during that time, the UDA or vigilantes, and, you know, that became the UDA, had set up sort of roadblocks at the end of the streets in the Shangle.
Despite the growing violence, Westminster remained keen to explore political solutions to the IRA. Early 1972 saw behind-the-scenes contacts between the British and the IRA aimed at securing a ceasefire through negotiation. These secret contacts helped to deliver a provisional IRA ceasefire in June 1972, which was to give breathing space for further negotiations with the government. The political route appeared to be showing some promise. However, the negotiations and the truce broke down within 3 weeks, and the IRA and the British were as far apart as ever. The reaction of the IRA to the breakdown of talks was delivered on the 21st of July. Bloody Friday saw 9 people killed by 22 separate bombs in Belfast city centre. It was seen as one of the most shocking events of the conflict.
When Bloody Friday happened, I think Protestants made up their mind, that's it. And the UDA came to the fore, they were going to defend us, and many, many young men joined the organisation for that reason. We would need to defend ourselves because obviously the British government wasn't going to defend us, they were going to make deals with these people who blew ordinary people up in a bus station.
I think Bloody Friday became the lever that actually said, no, this is it. You know, we have tolerated areas described as free dairy or particular areas of Belfast or whatever, and we can't tolerate it anymore, not against the scale of what else could possibly happen.
Bloody Friday was also the event that galvanised Westminster into large-scale military action against the IRA and set the tone for the following 22 years of conflict. Since the beginning of the year, Stormont had failed, negotiation had failed, and the killings had intensified. Faced with a desperate and deteriorating situation, the British government turned to the army to defeat the IRA. Once the decision had been made to take military action against the no-go areas and remove them by force, a planning process swung into action at military and political levels in Belfast and London. If the army were going to be used, then it would be in a decisive show of strength to remove the barricades and send the message to paramilitaries on all sides that there was no prospect of a military victory in Northern Ireland.
If we hadn't had Bloody Friday, when we had it, and to the extent that we had it, I'm not sure how much longer we might have gone on tolerating the no-go areas. But I mean, that was the final trigger that gave an impulse to the Secretary of State to say this cannot go on, it must stop now. The Secretary of State had made it absolutely clear that he did want military action to end the no-go area situation, both in Derry and in Belfast. And of course, what it did involve, inter alia, was a very substantial temporary reinforcement of the number of troops in the province.
We didn't really, I don't think, appreciate just how big that military force was going to be. And therefore, there was nearly a sense of excitement that we're going to get under it here.
This was the British government's first opportunity under direct rule to show the power that they could wield in Northern Ireland and underline the departure from the previous era of Stormont-led government. Bloody Sunday had provided a lesson to the British Army in the risks of deploying troops in and around the no-go areas. As a result, Motorman was to be a very different approach, taking place in the dead of night and with huge numbers of troops flooding the streets and overwhelming any opposition by sheer force of numbers.
The casualty rate that the Ministry of Defence had calculated was 20 to 25%. We're talking about that we had in the province at that time, with the reinforcements coming in, some 23,000 soldiers. So you'd be looking at a casualty rate, given on the MOD figures, of something like 5,500 injured, dead soldiers.
Given the number, size and geographic spread of the no-go areas across Belfast, Derry and in areas such as Lurgan, Newry, Armagh and Coal Island, it was determined that such a strategy would require a huge force of soldiers and military hardware.
I think that they took a conscious decision that they were going to dismantle the free dairy area, not just in the context of physically dismantling the barricades which surrounded the area at the time, but also, I believe, because they thought that taking these areas would deal a psychological blow to the nationalist community and to the Republican community and indeed to the IRA.
What became known as Operation Motorman was eagerly anticipated by all of us. It was there to resolve this problem, and it was designed to make sure that no longer would we be frustrated by being unable to patrol the areas we wanted to patrol, where we knew that there were weapons caches and material being hidden. And therefore we were looking forward to it very much indeed.
As it was planned, Motorman evolved into the biggest single British military operation since the Suez Crisis of 1956. As the plan developed, it became clear that almost 30,000 troops were required, including 5,500 members of the Ulster Defence Regiment, as well as Centurion demolition vehicles and HMS Fearless. As the troops were prepared and shipped into Northern Ireland, they were briefed on the operation at hand, but were largely unsure what to expect.
At the time, Northern Ireland was a bit scary. The Northern Ireland itself, but particularly Londonderry and Belfast, were actually war zones. I don't think people realise that these days, not even politicians. I was very, very frightened inside about that. For the first time in my life, I was going into an active service area.
They were safe havens. If you know that the police and the army are not going to follow you into a certain area, then it's safe as far as you're concerned, so you can do your shooting or do your bombing, etc., and then go back into the safe haven, or the no-go area, as we know them. And in my view, they had to be taken out. They had to rejoin the rest of the United Kingdom and come back under law and order.
The experience of the growing violence of 1972 led many of the soldiers to expect a violent confrontation and resistance from the IRA on the ground.
Confrontation with the IRA was inevitable, and we knew we were a superior army. They called themselves an army, but we knew we were far superior. We were well trained in counterinsurgency in my battalion. We'd had a number of tours of Aden in the 60s. And so we were perfectly confident, we were very confident that we would be able to take them on, and even on their own patch, we'd be able to defeat them if we could just get our hands on them.
But if you tried to get in there on a normal foot patrol, you got decimated because they had everything in there and we couldn't get in to get it out, like arms and stuff like this, everything. And if you had tried, well, you would have died, and that would have been the end of it.
Whilst the soldiers were prepared for organised resistance from the IRA, Republicans on the ground had other ideas. Faced with such a scale of operation, they knew that to fight would be foolish in the extreme.
Well, it was always my view that when they would make a move on the free dairy area, that it would be an unprecedented military operation, one which would pose huge risks to the lives of the citizens. And it was certainly my very strong view at the time, and I expressed it, that the IRA would have been very foolish to have put up military resistance because of the casualties that would have been inflicted on the community in these areas. And I think by dint of the fact that the IRA sensibly decided that they weren't going to get into a military engagement, which they would clearly have lost.
The build-up was something that wasn't unseen. It wasn't done secretly. It wasn't done in the middle of the night. You knew that where previously we were probably talking about 500 soldiers, 600 soldiers in Derry, that had trebled, that had quadrupled, and that there was machinery there that was capable of ploughing right through any barricades that we put up.
The IRA just weren't equipped to take the British on in a conventional fight, so everyone knew that they were going to melt away so that they could live to fight another day.
At a political level, there was a clear desire from the British to avoid confrontation, and the decision was taken to telegraph the operation and give every indication of what was planned. In the days preceding Motorman, troop levels surged and military activity was at an all-time high across Northern Ireland. It was clear that a major operation was in the offing.
Whitelaw's view, I think from the beginning, and certainly it was conclusive in the end, was that this action should be telegraphed. I mean, this wasn't intended to be a sort of war ready in tooth and claw that was aimed at shooting a whole lot of people. It was aimed at ending what was regarded as an intolerable affront to civil authority. And I mean, in a sense, the decision almost took itself, because you can't bring lots of reinforcements into the province and have lots of armoured vehicles, you know, moving about on the road in a particular direction without very intelligent people. One was dealing with very intelligent people twigging what was up. So, I mean, in a sense, it was an easy decision to take, but it was nevertheless a decision that Whitelaw did take. And I mean, I think my only part in the discussion was to say that I too agreed that was a very sensible thing to do. So it was telegraphed and you know, very directly telegraphed that it was going to happen.
I remember it being announced that this was going to happen, that the British Army was going to go into all these no-go areas and take the barricades down. And I have to say, probably most Protestants were pleased about that. It looked like the authorities was actually going to take some action at last.
Troop numbers into the province were increasing, particularly with specialist engineer units with heavy plant equipment such as bulldozers, etc. And at the end of the day, we knew something was going to happen. And it was announced on the media, the television and the press, because the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland actually said these barriers are going to come down sooner than later. And I realised, and my colleagues realised, that it was going to be in the next few days.
We were all told not to be at home, to stay out of our houses, that there was going to be a reaction from the British. Now, I would assume that had been planned long in advance before Bloody Friday, but that was the pretext for it.
On the eve of Operation Motorman at 9:30 p.m. on Sunday the 30th of July 1972, William Whitelaw's office issued the following warning.
As from the time of this announcement, there will be substantial activity in Northern Ireland. The object is to enable the security forces to move freely through all areas and so protect the community. Where such activities are taking place, people will best assist the security forces and protect themselves by keeping off the streets.
By announcing the operation, the British were hoping that confrontation could be avoided, or at least reduced. They had calculated that the IRA leadership would see the futility of opposing such a force of numbers, and that bloodshed would be avoided.
The people, I think, were as sensible in as ways as the IRA was, and recognised that if there was going to be a military push, it would have been one that would have been absolutely enormous dimensions, and of course that history has shown that that has proven to be the case.
It quickly became clear that the amount of British manpower being used was massive, and the IRA in Derry made a decision to dump weapons and to put up little or no resistance, certainly no armed resistance.
As the early hours of the 31st of July came, residents of the no-go areas waited nervously for the operation to begin. Whatever Motorman would bring, it would be at a scale previously unknown on the conflicted streets of Northern Ireland. With the decision taken to give warning of the beginning of Operation Motorman, it came as no surprise when the troops swung into action in the early hours of the 31st of July. Despite this forewarning and the intense speculation about Motorman, its scale was still a shock to many on the ground in Northern Ireland.
Well, this has been going on since 4 o'clock in the morning, and there's been quite an amount of activity and military activity in the area. And I've already heard that people have been put out of their homes and the army have occupied their homes.
I remember that day, all the army activity They were coming in, you could see them coming in, you could hear the tanks. You really had a great sense something was going on. As my mother would say, even the dogs in the street knew what was going to happen. We knew that the army were going to come in that night. We knew they were going to break through all the barricades.
I think what did come as a big surprise was the scale of it, which was absolutely enormous. And I was in the area at the time. I was on the Craigan estate. I was in a house on the Craigan estate at a point where I could see the vehicles coming into Craigan. And Craigan, of course, was only one part of the Free Dairy area. To stand in the top bedroom of a house and to see for hour after hour after hour military vehicles come into the estate, and to know that that was probably happening in other areas.
I felt that it was about the British government taking Derry back and taking parts of Belfast back, and it was for no other reason than that. And we always believed that once the British government done Operation Motorman, they would ease off on the IRA.
As it became clear that there was such an overwhelming force going to be used, the IRA took a decision that they could not defend the areas against such a force, and ordered all IRA volunteers to stand down and dump their weapons. They gave instruction to the volunteers to stand about and, if possible, to organise some token resistance, but not to have the weapons, get the weapons to safe locations.
When they come up the street, they pulled the armoured Saracen outside the house. A load of soldiers came out of the back. And as they were about to kick in the front door, my mother, being the feisty wee woman that she is, had a row of milk bottles sitting in the up window just above the door, and started throwing them down, because we lived in an upstairs flat, and started throwing them down as the soldiers were trying to kick in the door. And a soldier fired a rubber bullet up at the window at her. But when they came in, they tossed my grandfather out of his bed. They beat my younger brother up a bit, imprisoned my mother in a bathroom, and started ripping up floorboards and stuff like that, searching for whatever they thought might be there. And it just seemed like 5 or 6 doors down the street, and it seemed like there was a soldier in every front and back garden that I looked at. That's how big it seemed.
Was there somebody in the house when the bulldozer hit it?
Yes, there was. There was a man. And he's an old age pensioner, and he isn't well. And he has to fly downstairs when the sergeant deliberately ran into his home. I've seen it. From my house, I've watched all they've done today in this area. They deliberately went into that man's house.
In some areas of Derry, first aid posts had been established by volunteers, fearing the worst in the wake of Bloody Sunday and anxious to prevent loss of life.
A lot of teenagers come out of houses and they started to lift whatever they could find in the ground, and they were throwing stones and firing stones at the soldiers, so the soldiers would back off again. And then the soldiers would come towards them and they would run away. It was like a cat and mouse game, and that went on for a while. One soldier dropped his knee, he just dropped down and he aimed a rifle and he just shot into the crowd. And I could see this young fella getting shot as he was kind of going over a fence. And he dropped to the ground and everything went silent. And then a group of adults came out of a house at the corner of Benevna Gardens, and they dragged him into the house.
At that time when the call went out for a doctor, no doctor, called for a nurse, the hero that I am, I grabbed a tract who's now my wife and pushed her out the door. And I knew that if somebody was shot, if he needed a chance at all, she was the one. You know, she had experience, she had the skill, she could do it. So I made the decision for her and pushed her out, you know.
So I was kind of reluctant, but because it was after Bloody Sunday, 6 months earlier, and people were getting shot in the street. The other first aider and him stayed behind. So I was outside the door and looking at all the soldiers pointing their guns, and I was terrified. So when I got into the house, there was pandemonium in the house and everybody was shouting and roaring, and this poor young fellow was lying on the ground. And I looked then, and sure enough, he had 2 gunshots, he had an entry and exit wound. I put on field dressings, so I had a field dress in either one. I wasn't sure then why his hip was broken, so I splinted him up. I splinted both legs together, and it took ages for the ambulance to arrive. And when the ambulance did arrive, I handed him over, told them everything I did and what I did. That was Motorman, and I'll never forget it.
It wasn't only the residents that were fearful around the operation. The troops were unsure of the intentions of Republicans on the ground and were briefed and trained to expect confrontation. Neither side knew what the other would do.
I was very surprised when we actually entered the area to clear the so-called barricades and no-go part of the area, that we didn't meet with fierce resistance. We were actually expecting to have to fight our way in. But as it turned out, we just walked in and took the place over.
I went to the bottom of New Lodge Road by Gallagher's cigarette factory, and there was a riot going on by the time we got there. We got out the Saracen and started firing rubber bullets. My troop sergeant come up to me and said, "You're making them too hostile, you've got to stop firing so many rubber bullets." And I said, "Well, in a minute they're going to be firing real bullets at us."
Whilst the IRA had been officially instructed not to engage the troops militarily, many young Republicans were still determined that the British Army would not simply be allowed to occupy the no-go areas without opposition. As rioting developed sporadically in parts of Cregan and the Bogside, it became clear that the Army was willing and able to use force to ensure the success of the operation. In the midst of this confusion of rioting and troop movements, the Army opened fire on a group of youths in the Cregan estate in the early hours. Seamus Bradley, a 19-year-old member of the IRA, was killed. The official statements of the soldiers involved in the killing say they opened fire upon a man holding what appeared to be a Thompson machine gun. This is strongly disputed by all other witnesses, and no weapon was found.
Seamus was one of the few active service units that were still in the Derry area on the night of the 30th, but they too were stood down and their weapons were dumped. They stood about the Cregan shops waiting to see what the crowd, many Brits, but again they became aware that it was an overwhelming force and no resistance was possible. His unit broke up and went in different directions. Seamus walked down the Chapel Lane and he was shot.
I believe the first time Seamus was shot, he fell. And when he got back up again, he started running again. He was then shot again, and I believe it was his foot was shot because at this time he couldn't get up.
His body was taken eventually to St. Peter's School, where the Brits had set up a temporary camp. It was established by independent medical evidence that had Seamus received proper medical assistance, he would probably be alive today.
At around the same time as Seamus Bradley's death, a second young man was shot and killed by troops deployed in Motorman. Daniel Hegarty was a 15-year-old boy with no political or paramilitary connections.
Well, I know our Daniel always wanted to see a tank. I know he wanted to see the size of them and how many soldiers it would have held. And I know we were all put to our bed that night. I know we were put to our bed. But because we lived so close to the shops, there was a siren on top of the flats. And that went on all night, so you never slept through it. We were all woke up. And as usual, we were carrying on, jumping from one bed to the other, because we never thought nothing of it. We were just messing about in the house. And Daniel came from his room and the our room. He looked at a pillow and hit me and the other two sisters and says, "Stop it, carry on, stop torturing me, Ma." And I turned around and told him to get lost. And that was the last time I seen him and spoke to him. I sort of feel guilty for telling him to get lost, because I didn't realise that he wasn't coming back.
Daniel and his cousins Thomas and Christopher, hearing the stories that tanks were rolling into Cregan, were keen to see one for themselves. As the three boys walked along Cregan Heights in the early hours, they encountered a foot patrol. For reasons that remain unclear to this day, the patrol opened fire on the boys, shooting both Daniel and Christopher in the head. Daniel died in his cousin's arms as the soldiers withdrew without searching or questioning the boys.
the soldier says he shouted 3 warnings, and they know now he shouted nothing. He never shouted no warnings, and he murdered him. And he shot him at point blank range. I dare say if I was talking to that soldier, he could actually tell me the colour of my brother's eyes. He was that close to him.
As a surreal sense of a new normality was established, with troops on many street corners and Saracens and Centurions in parks and gardens across Belfast and Derry, life in Northern Ireland went on.
Well, of course it was a day we were married. Special day in any couple's lives.
It was also my birthday.
Her 22nd birthday. Everybody in the town knew that Motorman was coming. We heard the Saracens bolting up, we heard the arriving. Oh, just general mayhem. I went on through the night, and about 8 o'clock the next morning, I was dressed, and my brother was my best man, our Thomas. So we knew we had to get down the street and see what the crack was. A big officer came across, and I said, look, I'm getting married this morning, as you can appreciate. I said, look, we're expecting 2 cars on to come in to take the bride, and he says, no, he says, I'm sorry. There'll be no cars allowed. Nobody's moving at all, he says. So look, can you not, be even a bit lenient, or I played it with him. And he came back, he said, look, well, that 1 car, and he says. I said, so everybody's going to go into 1 car, but I said, well, that's okay. Agreed, we couldn't disagree. What was the point?
Well, we had no choice, as to say. We didn't have any choice at all. You just get into the car. You were glad to get a car to get into, to get to the chapel. Otherwise, you would have had to walk through all the soldiers, through all the barricades. That's what we lived in, a war zone, you know what I mean? And that's what it was like that morning, just a war zone. When there was maybe 4 times or 5 times soldiers.
All through the mass, you heard the shooting, you heard the rubber bullets, you heard the bangs going off. But we just went on with the wedding as best we could and got the wedding over. But it was just a surreal day. Like, it didn't spoil the day for us. And maybe it made the day for us, truthfully, because if it had happened the day before or the day after, it's just been another wedding, another day. But it was Motorman Day, and other things were happening, and it's just one of those days you never forget. That's it.
Whilst the operation to clear Derry's no-go areas saw the deaths of 2 young men, in Belfast, Motorman appeared more successful.
People basically stayed indoors. They didn't want to look at us or see us or anything else. It was very quiet. We just walked in and commenced patrolling. I have to admit, feeling pretty disappointed myself that we were just walking in. And there was no big firefight like I expected, and no prolonged battle. But at the same time, you can't help but think, don't be so silly. You know, you don't really want to put your life on the line in such a silly way for such a silly thing. Be grateful for the fact that we got in peacefully.
I remember that the area was totally and utterly swamped. Hundreds of troops everywhere. They started occupying buildings in the area, particularly high-rise flats. There are a number of them in the New Lodge, and they took over the top of those and they set in place permanent lookout posts.
We then started searching houses, and houses that we hadn't been able to search previously, and I seem to remember in my battalion in particular, in my company in particular, there were a couple of finds that they weren't particularly great, but there were a couple of finds, both of weapons and in intelligence type information.
In military terms, it was immediately obvious that Motorman had been a success. As the troops poured in virtually unopposed, the barricades tumbled and the rule of British law was returned across the whole of Northern Ireland.
I'm delighted with the way so far the whole operation has gone. One was terrified the whole time that there was going to be a lot of people killed, innocent people killed. That's been avoided. I'm delighted to say it's the last thing we wanted. The one thing we wanted to avoid was any form of death and injury to innocent people. The only people we have any quarrel with are the gunmen and the murderers and the terrorists.
In the context of the time, and given the scale of the operation, the deaths of Seamus Bradley and Daniel Hegarty, whom the army had claimed were both armed, were viewed as regrettable. But there was a general sense that much greater violence had been avoided.
You know, tanks coming up the foyle, in boats tells you that the British were prepared for the greatest possible resistance. But more importantly, I think if the IRA had have put up military resistance, those numbers would have been far in excess of the two that have been killed, and I think there would have been widespread casualties right throughout, not just the Craigan, but the Brandywell, the Bogside, and other parts of the city.
Just hours after Motorman had commenced, there was a stark reminder that ending the no-go areas would not in itself bring an end to the conflict. Shortly after 10 a.m. on the morning of the 31st of July, 3 bombs exploded without warning in the village of Claudy, a few miles outside of Derry City. 6 civilians were killed immediately, with a further 3 dying later from their injuries. Whilst it's not clear that the bombs were directly connected to Motorman, Claudy underlined the fact that the conflict would not be easily ended. But despite the horror of Claudy, Motorman did have an immediate impact on the spiralling violence that had characterised the first half of 1972. Faced with military occupation on every street, Republicans were forced to rethink their strategies.
I mean, you had foot patrols literally of 120 soldiers coming down Beachmount Parade into Beachmount Avenue under the Falls Road, so it was quite intimidating. I mean, it looked like a major occupation. But as I said, I mean, the IRA quickly adapted to that situation. In fact, I think there's probably an argument being made that they had too many soldiers, and that there was a finite number of soldiers that could work at optimum doing the job of trying to curtail and curb the IRA.
I was in the city and remained in the city for many weeks after Operation Motorman, and many of my friends also remained in the city. And of course the British were searching for us all over the place, but I still moved around, and obviously we had to disguise ourselves and so forth, and there were actually several occasions in the weeks after Operation Motorman where I was physically stopped and searched by the British Army, who hadn't got the foggiest notion that I was Martin McGuinness. So I presume if I had been arrested at that time, I, in all probability would have been either shot or interned.
The death rate of July 1972 was never surpassed, as Motorman helped to bring Northern Ireland back from the brink. Such troop levels were not sustainable, and as the operation was wound down in December 1972, the British Army were able to claim that they had returned the rule of law to the streets of Northern Ireland.
Well, the operation's gone very well. As a result of what we started at 4 o'clock this morning, the position now in Northern Ireland is that anyone can go anywhere at any time, and that's what I wanted to achieve.
But what Motorman had really achieved was to change the dynamic of the conflict and send a clear message from Westminster that the British government were prepared to take on the IRA with real resources and give Northern Ireland their fullest attention. This presented a challenge which the IRA simply evolved to meet, and the tone was set for a further 22 years of military confrontation, but in a changed context of full British engagement, which made any military victory for the IRA unlikely and ultimately helped create the conditions for a political settlement to be reached.
I'm a firm believer that Motorman achieved its purpose without a shadow of doubt. The purpose was 2 or 3-fold, but certainly one was to send a very clear message that these were the streets of the United Kingdom, and we wouldn't allow armed militants to take over the streets and prevent the security forces from patrolling them.
It wasn't really our fight, and it wasn't that I ever wanted to sort of be involved in keeping no-go areas. I think it was, you know, I seen it for what it was, and for me it was one operation, but it wasn't really enough in terms of that. And you know, I suppose I was thinking and planning about what would happen next in terms of our fight against the IRA.
History would prove that Operation Motorman was a success, and as a result of that success, it was instrumental in bringing the conflict to its close. And it may have taken 30 years, but all these little triumphs, all these little successes, which Motorman was one, were instrumental in finishing the conflict.
You had a militaristic mindset within the higher echelons of the British government. We were seen as upstarts. We were seen as people who were standing up for ourselves. We were seen as people who were not prepared to bow the knee to the injustices and the inequalities and discriminations and domination that existed. So we were seen as people who had to be put down.
If the British government actually thought that Operation Motorman was going to close down this war, that it didn't. And that by the end of 1972, it would have been the bloodiest year of a long, bloody conflict.
Whilst Motorman did help to slow the wave of killings in 1972, its legacy reverberates to this day. A second inquest into Daniel Hegarty's death in 2011 found unanimously that he posed no risk to the army when he was killed. The British Army has apologised for labelling him a terrorist after his death, but to date, no one has been charged with his killing. The killing of Seamus Bradley was examined by the Historical Inquiries team, who found that his death was not effectively investigated in 1972. His family are currently campaigning for a new inquest into the circumstances of his death. The Claudy bombings became one of the most notorious atrocities of the conflict. Despite two separate investigations by the RUC and the PSNI and a report by the Police Ombudsman, no one has been charged in connection with the killings. 40 years on, and the sheer scale of Operation Motorman still seems incredible. Twice as many troops were used as are currently in Afghanistan. And today the use of such massive military force on the streets of the UK would be unthinkable. The legacy of Motorman may live on, but the violence and horror of that time are consigned to history. A sign, perhaps, of just how far Northern Ireland has come.